If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Law enforcement, what was the most scary, paranormal call or incident you have responded to? I am a police officer working on an emergency response team on a busy London borough. We took a call to a suspected domestic incident in a block of flats. The informant said that she could hear screaming and sounds of disturbance coming from the flat above her own. Once we arrived, my colleague and I knocked on the door of the flat the informant said the noise was coming from. I had heard nothing on my way up and certainly couldn't hear any disturbance coming from the address. To be honest, I heard nothing at all. After knocking twice, we had no response. My colleague left me to go downstairs and speak directly to the informant. I stayed by the door. I knocked again, and after some time it was answered by an elderly woman. She had clearly been asleep and was alarmed to see me standing outside. I told her that someone had called saying that they could hear a disturbance coming from within her address. I asked her if there was anyone else inside with her. She looked bemused and told me that she lived alone and had been sleeping. I asked her if I could come in to satisfy myself that no one else was there. She invited me in and I walked into what was a small 2-bedroom flat. The flat was in darkness apart from her hall light and her bedside lamp. I began searching through the flat. As I approached the final door, the living room, my colleague called me up on the radio. He told me that he was on his way and asked if I was okay. I told him everything was fine, wondering why he sounded so flustered. He told me that he was with the informant and could also hear screaming and loud thuds coming from the flat I was in. I told him that he must be mistaken, as I was almost done searching the flat and that I had heard nothing whatsoever. I have to admit a feeling of unease as I opened the final door. Like all the other rooms, it was in darkness but was freezing cold. My breath misted immediately. There was no one in the room and no signs of disturbance. No window was open. I called my colleague and asked him to listen out for my footfall. He said he could hear my feet as I stamped them, but said that the screaming had stopped. This coincided with me opening the door. I left shortly after, apologizing to the elderly woman for waking her. I have no rational explanation for this at all. My colleague and I left feeling very creeped out. Late evening, maybe a decade ago, I ended up running silent to a call with additional units in tow. The caller reported hearing footsteps on her second floor when she was in the kitchen. She lived alone, middle-aged, divorced, no kids, and had no expected company. She is outside across the street when we arrive, obviously unnerved and being calmed by her neighbor. Other units showed up almost as I did and set up a perimeter at the corners of the property. We talk with her, get permission to enter, so we decide we'll announce ourselves and clear the house. 3 of us stack up on the front door, announce and make entry while the other officers are viewing the windows from a distance under concealment. She was in the midst of making a really late dinner, so the house smells really good. I remember how good it smelled. Anyway, we clear the ground level and make our way to the stairs when we hear it. Obviously footsteps on the wood floors above us. Not a panicky "oh shit, I'm caught" footsteps and running to hide or escape. No, these were calm, methodic and almost pace-like. We announce ourselves again and in a response, except the pacing just starts to sort of fade away. Quietly I make my way up the steps, adrenaline pumping and concentrating on pieing the corner at the top. I stop a few stairs shy of the corner, breathe, and proceed up. The hallway at the top was pitch black, and after successfully clearing the top/corner we make our way down the hallway, clearing rooms. Nothing. Nobody. Not even a critter. Not that any critter would ever make what I describe as human footsteps on hardwood. After the initial search, a few of the other officers involved also checked every nook and cranny, bed, closet, rack, hell, even the washer, dryer, appliances and cupboards were thoroughly searched. Nothing was out of order. Nobody was hiding anywhere. Eventually we invite the lady back into her residence and reassure her that there was nobody in there, and we equated her noise to maybe wood shrinkage or expansion in the home. None of the officers outside and after our initial search had seen anybody leave the top or bottom floors or windows. The house had no indications that anybody tried to force open a window or door. I stayed behind for about 30 minutes once the other officers cleared the call and waited while her friend showed up to stay the night with her. I went over basic security measures with her and double-checked all her windows and doors were not compromised. She fed me well-done lasagna as I waited, and to this day, I'm convinced that I interacted with another dimension of life that day. About 4 years ago, a lady who I'll call Lucy, called our non-emergency line and said she locked herself out of her house. I responded to take the report in case FD needed to force entry. I arrived first and immediately noticed a burning candle and some Jesus-y statues in the upstairs window. The light in this room was also on. I can't explain it, but it seemed a bit odd to me. Anyways, I approached Lucy, who appeared to be about 65 years old, and asked what happened. She said she walked to her car to get groceries for her and her mother but forgot her keys inside and the door had locked behind her. I asked if her mother was home and Lucy replied in the affirmative. Lucy went on to say she technically lived alone because her mom died 6 years prior, but she still lives with her in the bedroom with a lit candle and makes her presence known by turning on/off lights, opening/closing doors, and turning on the bathroom faucet. I then walked the perimeter of the home and found an unlocked window into the kitchen. Since Lucy never actually left home and knew no one else was inside, I radioed dispatch and climbed in through the window with her consent. As my boot touched the kitchen floor, I heard an audible click. At the same time, the lights in the stairway and upstairs hallway to my left turned off. I quickly walked to the rear sliding door to my right and advised Lucy what had happened. Lucy laughed and said that was just her mom saying hello. I told Lucy that although I genuinely believe what she told me was true, I still had to do my due diligence and ensure no one else was inside. I radioed for a back and within minutes my buddy arrived. The first thing he asked about was the lit candle in the window. While clearing the upstairs, we came upon the room where the candle was and immediately noticed it was blown out. There were no open windows, fans, vents, or other obvious source that could have extinguished the flame. We just looked at each other with a bit of unease and went back downstairs to leave. Click, the upstairs lights turned off behind us. We talked to Lucy for another 5 minutes and suggested getting a battery-operated candle just to be safe. Well, Lucy clearly thought fuck the police because to this day, that candle burns in the open window most nights when I drive by. And every now and then I'll stop and talk to Lucy to see how she and her mother are doing. I worked at the Naval Hospital in Camp Pendleton in 2013. I was part of the transition team that moved the last of the belongings that they wanted from their old location to their new one. Along with others on my team, we were part of the final sweep as far as cleaning up, waxing the floors and locking up some of the higher level rooms within the old hospital. It was a nice gig because there was a ton of office supplies that was going to just get thrown away along with some office chairs. I like to draw, so I took home 2 chairs, one for me and one for my roommate, along with a plethora of pens and paper. In my duty section there was also the security role of watching over the barracks that was just outside of the hospital. With the Navy, being the Navy, they didn't transfer anyone over to the new barracks till about a full 8 months after the move to the new hospital. So someone still had to stand duty there as well as patrol the old hospital as to keep away any would-be vandals from a place they thought was completely abandoned. Of course I would end up getting duty one day and would start getting people coming into the commons area telling to go look at the hospital. There was very clearly a light on in 6th or 7th floor with a figure standing motionless watching outside. I put up a sign to say that I would be leaving the office and to call my personal number should they need anything. Usually it was just to reset their key cards, but each room had 4 rooms within it, so usually people just called their roommates to open the doors instead of waiting for the process of me resetting their key card. It was already pretty late at night, so I wasn't worried about it. I would go to the hospital and it was still completely locked all around. I checked to make sure that no windows were ajar, but the hospital didn't have any that opened. I even tried to lift the back hatch that linens and new supplies came through by truck, and that was still secured. I had no other way of getting in myself, so when my chief came down around 2 a.m., as they seldomly did but were required to at least once a night, I made a report of it. By this time the figure was gone but the light remained on. I was never told if they ever found anyone or if it was even followed up on for that matter. But it was one of the creepiest things I remember from being there. Not really scary, but possibly paranormal, and a case I was never able to solve. 3 years ago, I was called into an investigation of a burglary in a cemetery. When the forensics guys and I finally went out there, it was a slow morning. None of the responding deputies had actually gone inside yet. 4 deputies and a sergeant were busy securing the scene from the outside, because it was still dark out and they didn't want to go into the dark mausoleum that had been broken into. Apparently they felt much safer with us overweight non-sworn employees around, so we went inside together. The exterior door to the mausoleum had been forced open, and we started looking around for signs of anything stolen or vandalized. Eventually we did find that one of the grave sites in the mausoleum, almost 15 feet off the ground, had the cement plaque shattered and the coffin was pulled out and left sprawling on the floor. All contents of the coffin were missing, which including the cremated remains of 3 people, the last one who died in 2004. A person would have had to bring their own ladder to pull this out, or been at least 12 to 13 feet tall. According to the forensics guy, it looked like the plaque for the coffin had been shattered from the inside, due to water damage. Still, it seems oddly coincidental that a plaque would simultaneously break on the night of a break-in to the mausoleum. It hadn't been accessed since 2004, so almost 12 years prior. The people in the grave site had a single living relative. I called them, exchanged pleasantries, and then when I asked about the mausoleum they said no habla English and hung up. It's probably drug related, somehow, but this is exactly the kind of thing that would happen at the start of a vampire or zombie apocalypse movie. Had a couple of weird things occur one night, was working night shift in a small town and received a call to the hospital. The call was from the lone security guard on site who didn't feel comfortable dealing with this on his own. The call was dispatched as urgent assistance. On arrival to the hospital, the guard stated to me that nursing staff had heard what they referred to as blood-curdling screams coming out of the then closed psychiatric unit. There were no patients or staff in the unit at the time. The door to the unit was a clear glass door and there was nothing visible on the other side. I requested the keys to unlock the door. After turning the key in the door and unlocking the deadbolt, before I was able to remove the keys from the door, something had forced the lock and relocked the door, resulting in my hand, still holding the key, to be physically moved as well. I was pretty creeped out myself, lol, but based on the severity of the call I still entered the room and conducted a search of the entire unit with no result. Immediately after clearing the unit, another call came in, but this time it was from a nurse walking to her car on the street. She also heard loud screams. I ran down to the hospital parking lot where another unit met me and we searched the area. I then came across a small park and could hear a very faint squeaking sound. I followed the sound only to come across a swing set of 4 swings. 3 swings were absolutely still as there was no wind, and the other was moving almost as there was someone still sitting in it and pumping to gain momentum. I stood there in awe for a good 30 seconds and the swing did not lose any momentum. What a weird night. 911 operator here. I've told this story before, but the first overdose call I took after I finished up my training stuck with me for a long time. There was a house full of people high as a kite on a whole slew of stuff and one guy odds on heroin. So they call 911 and I'm walking them through stuff while my officers and EMS are on the way. Mind you, this whole time I can hear the agonal breathing in the background and everyone else in the room going batshit crazy, understandably, as their friend is dying in front of them. So I'm trying to walk them through my emergency medical dispatch steps, and not a single person in the room is coherent or calm enough to be of any help. All of this while they lie about what he was owing on, making it take more time for Narcan to be administered, as my officers didn't know it was heroin until a few minutes after they arrived. The subject lived, so it all turned out well. The next one is newer. A few months ago I took a rape call and that one was the toughest emotionally so far. This girl, who was young, I think 20, but I can't remember, calls in and is just broken on the phone. She's not crying anymore, but you can tell she had been. The poor girl had been out for a run on our trails and some guy jumped out and pinned her down and raped her. As if that wasn't bad enough, she was a virgin. Fortunately, we ended up catching the guy about a month later. Investigative work takes forever, after my detectives combed through thousands of hours of video footage in order to find his home and ID him. I was a Met police officer serving with the Diplomatic Protection Group during the 80s. I was on night duty on protection of a government building in Carlton House Terrace in central London. It was in the early hours of the morning and I decided to take a walk around the outside perimeter to check that all was well. I opened the front door to see a young boy standing about 12 feet away from me. He was wearing an Edwardian tweed cap, jacket and +4 trousers and long socks. He was also carrying a heavy old-style leather football. Where this property is used a great deal for filming as it is very atmospheric. Think Sherlock Holmes. I said, "Hello, what are you doing here?" He smiled and bounced the ball. I realized that the ball made no sound upon striking the ground. I then saw standing behind him was a lady, late 30s, wearing a small straw hat with flowers and cherries on it. She was wearing a long cream cotton dress, Edwardian style with leg of mutton sleeves. She beckoned to the boy with her hand to come to her. He smiled at me and waved and joined the women. They turned away from me and vanished. I know that I was not dreaming. I requested a signal check on my radio to my control. Perhaps I had experienced a time slip? Military policeman in the Marine Corps. While stationed at Camp Lejeune, a dispatcher got a call from a terrified wife that kids were trying to get into her house. It was a little after midnight. We thought this was just a drunken spouse call and responded not on high alert, just kinda wanted to make sure the lady was alright. We knock on the door and announce ourselves. The woman is obviously shaken still with puffy eyes. She tells us 4 children with red eyes rang her doorbell and asked to come inside, and when she refused they got angry. The kids terrorized her for the 5 minutes. Her own child was put to bed and her husband was deployed. I decided to do a once-over of the whole housing property and it was a whole load of nothing going on. My partner and I decide to do a little walking patrol of the housing area. In each housing area there's usually a decent-sized playground. As we were walking up to it we both see some kids swinging, Curfew is 8 p.m. for young children unless accompanied by an adult on base. I'm fucking spooked at this point and I know my partner is too. They look over at us and just stare. We started backtracking and then turned and didn't look back, didn't talk about it the rest of the night either. Later on I looked up the incident online since Lejeune is famous for lots of paranormal activity and turns out the little red-eyed kids have been reported before. Maybe it's not creepy for many users, but for me, it was absolutely terrifying, maybe because I was 10 years old at that moment. It was a normal day and me and my friends were having fun doing some challenges. One of us suggested calling people and doing pranks, and we all agreed. We pranked some people and we were having fun until we called a mysterious number and a man answered. Pause. I know it'll sound very repetitive and some people surely won't believe, but I'm 99% sure this was absolutely real. When the man answered, he sounded really drunk and surely he was. He also sounded annoyed, because we interrupted his work, I think. None of us wanted to speak and the man for some reason didn't hang up. We heard some screams after 1 minute. If it was a prank for us, how ironic. I swear it sounded realistic as F. I assumed the man and a woman, probably his wife, were arguing. After 5 minutes of that, and yes, we still wanted to know how it was gonna end and we regret not hanging up the phone at the right time, we suddenly heard gunshots. Yep, gunshots. As soon as that happened we hung up. We were still terrified and the man called us. He noticed he didn't hang up, I guess, and warned us not to say anything and forget everything we heard. We did not say a single word after all of that and we all went home in fear. Responded to a call where a woman was being stabbed. Not to death, she lived, but it would have been to death if we didn't get there. Me and my partner/good friend got dispatched with really nothing more than person on other line, not saying much, possible domestic. We knock on the door, there's no answer. We start snooping around the windows to see if we can hear anything. I start to get a really bad feeling, but why? My buddy's like, man, this might be a prank call. We can't go into the house because we have no idea if there's someone hurt, if this is indeed the correct house, or if a crime has even been committed, but something is telling me not to leave. After pounding on the door for 15 minutes, a woman comes dashing out of the house with stab wounds all over her. A man comes out behind her with bloody hands holding 2 knives and we arrest him. It was weird because normally we would just leave after someone doesn't answer the door. But something told me to stay. So but I worked security for a few years out of high school and have some weird ones. So me and another guard became pretty good friends and would often talk to each other over the phone and earpiece for most of the night while patrolling. One time he found a door to the basement of the oldest building in our state or city or something like that, and the basement was also infamously haunted. Now he hadn't said anything about what he was doing other than which building he was at, and we had been silent for a few minutes when I heard over the phone the word door being whispered/hissed in a drawn-out way with an audible inhale/exhale at the end. At first I thought it was him and asked him to repeat himself, and he was confused and said that he hadn't said anything. I didn't want to freak him out, so I didn't say anything until after he'd left the building about what I'd heard. He was pretty freaked out by it, and it would have been very out of character for him to have done that with me. 2. Another one that was most likely just a weird coincidence. We were transporting a psych patient from an ER to a psyche facility who was completely fucked out of his mind, mostly unaware of everything around him, and verbal but not making any sense, and in an almost sleepwalking headspace from appearances. The nurses had doped him up but said he'd been in the same mental state, just more agitated beforehand. The antipsychotics had only really calmed him down. The first thing he does after loading him in the vehicle and me sitting down next to him was turn to me, appearing suddenly lucid, and saying conversationally, "Well, you look like you're ready to bury another dog." The morning of I'd found my dog passed away in her sleep and had buried her. After looking at me expectantly for a few moments while I was a little confused and shocked, the appearance of lucidity on his face and eyes slowly faded away before he turned back to mumbling and rocking back and forth and trying to eat the bag of chips the nurses sent with him. Not the chips out of the bag, mind you, but the bag of chips. 3. My least favorite building to patrol at night very often would have doors unlocked on my second and third patrols, after I'd found them locked beforehand. Many times bay doors which required a latch to be lifted from the inside would be unlocked. The building had alarms attached to every door, that I'd have to disarm every time I opened one of the doors, so they worked. The building owners were not concerned in the least and simply said that the doors did that, and that's why they hired us to keep them locked. If it had been employees opening one of the entrance doors, then I would have been able to see which employee, and at what time they'd been unlocked, which happened occasionally, but I'd always been informed to expect that on the nights it occurred. I'd also hear hissing noises, thumping from the roof, and the occasional bay door being shaken, as though by wind, but with none of the bay doors next to it being shaken. That place creeped me the fuck out. The guard before me had quit at 2 in the morning, After ending a patrol at that site halfway through, a few weeks after getting promoted to lieutenant, driven straight back to the office and left his gear and letter of resignation and refused to return any calls. I had a friend who was good friends with that guard and asked him if he knew what happened. He just said that the guard refused to talk about it. 4. Another time we were going to pick up a psyche patient from an ER, and when passing the hospital morgue during either late night or early morning, heard loud sobbing coming from in there. We flagged down a nurse and told them, who called the hospital security to come check it out, and they found nothing. The hallway the morgue was in had a few other rooms that were all locked and closed, but the sound had seemed to be coming directly from the morgue. 5. Another site I would patrol at night was an outdoor theater at the edge of town. A body had been found on an undeveloped part of the grounds and was thought to be a victim of Ted Bundy, as the time and area of death matched up with when Ted Bundy was in the area and active. However, it was never proven. This place was creepy as fuck, and I didn't even know about the murder until after I'd been working it for a while. Now I'm very used to being outside at night in a rural area, where there's no electric lights, but this place had this oppressive darkness that seemed to absorb any light. Even on nights with a full moon I had to use a flashlight to be able to see anything. And even my flashlight seemed to have less reach and illumination there. Apart from the weird darkness, there was only ever one unexplained incident. It was the first night I was patrolling there. I'd stopped halfway through my patrol to have a smoke break and turned off my flashlight because the battery was running low. After finishing my cigarette, I went back to my patrol and turned my flashlight on and froze. Alarm bells started to go off in my head, but I wasn't sure why. I hadn't heard or seen anything, but I just had this strong feeling that something was off. Then I realized what it was. My shadow was being cast out in front of me, as though there was a light shining on me from behind. I yelped and jumped around, bringing my hands up, thinking there was somebody behind me, but there was nothing. I didn't see anything that would have cast my shadow that direction, and I didn't fuck around to see if my shadow would keep on doing that. I turned my light off and returned to my car, using my much dimmer phone light to see because I didn't want to see my shadow in front of me again. Lol. I never had that happen again at that property, and later tried to recreate it in the same position with no luck, and other than just being creepy and weirdly dark, there were no more incidents that I couldn't find a rational explanation for at that site, although a mountain lion's screams and a guy proposing to his fiancée both about gave me heart attacks there. So I'm not a cop, but when I was a kid my mom had to call them on 2 occasions, and here's why. When I was 5 we moved into a home built in 1840 and remodeled it. Lots of weird stuff would happen, and while renovating the kitchen we even found human remains. Yes, they were reported and collected, but we never heard back. Anyway, when I was about 13 I was at a friend's house for the night. My mom was in the living room below my bedroom and she heard what sounded like someone trashing my bedroom, smashing out my window and jumping onto the roof of the front porch. She naturally called the police and nothing was touched. No one could explain what happened. Another night I was asleep in my room and my dog started growling, which woke me up. When I woke up it sounded like all the drawers downstairs were being thrown open and glass was breaking. I also heard boots walking. This was before cell phones and I just tried to keep my dog quiet. I gave him a bone and I army crawled to my brother's room down the hall. He was awake and heard it too. He got his baseball bat and went into my mom's room, and she already had 911 on the line. The police arrived and heard the noises from outside the house. Once again, no signs of forced entry, nothing moved. There was also fresh snow on the ground and no abnormal steps outside. A lot happened in that house, but these were the 2 times the law was involved and no one could explain anything. Obligatory, I'm not a cop, but my uncle is. Christmas time about 10 or 15 years ago there was a gathering at my grandma's house. So all of his immediate family, his wife, kids, parents, you get the idea, are all in one house. He was able to be at the gathering for a bit, but was still a patrolman at the time and worked that evening, so he left early. He wasn't gone that long. I was young at the time so I don't remember how long exactly, when a few of us noticed this cop car with lights flashing, siren blaring, come flying down the street. It then haphazardly pulls into my grandma's yard and my uncle comes running out and up to the house, throws open the door, comes barreling in and asks/screams what's wrong while looking around at everyone. And we're all just kinda standing there like WTF? And tell him everybody is fine. Apparently there had been a 911 call and hang up, or unresponsive, can't remember which, from grandma's address. We were all in the same room, toddlers were accounted for and hadn't recently been found playing with any phones. No one had been near or on any of her phones for a while. It took a bit to calm my uncle down, he was really shaken up by the whole thing. Not my story. I love these kinds of stories and often ask people if anything strange has ever befallen them. Don't use the word paranormal, people get edgy around that word. This is a story I heard from a guy I worked with in the Air Force while stationed at Osan-ab in South Korea in 2003. He said that when he was at his first duty station in Germany, about 10 years previous, he and another airman were rooming together in this small basement apartment off base. One night, he wakes in his tiny room to see a dark shadow person standing in front of his window. He jerks fully awake, and they're gone. The thing is that the bed is actually pushed against that window, so there isn't room for a person to stand. He assumes he was dreaming but is too rattled to go back to sleep, so after tossing and turning for hours he gives up and gets up. Same thing happens the next night. So he risks ridicule and asks his housemate if they'd been in his room the previous night around 3 a.m. The answer was no, accompanied by ridicule. This happens to him every night for the next 2 weeks at 3 a.m. Eventually, it doesn't really shock him anymore. He sees the guy. Tries to focus on him. It disappears. He knows he won't sleep, so he gets up around 3:15, makes coffee, watches TV until time for work. So one morning, usual routine. He's just sitting down on the couch with coffee in hand when a fireball shoots out of the stove that heats the apartment and ignites a dried up houseplant a couple feet away. He jumps up and puts the fire out by throwing the plant in the bathtub. And he was never bothered by the dark shadow again. I am not a cop, but this involves a cop, When I was 19 to 20, I lived in Maryland and was obsessed with photographing abandoned houses in some of the run-down suburban areas around where I grew up. I got arrested, aka driven home in cuffs and slapped on the wrist, a lot for trespassing, but I was dumb and this didn't stop me. So I went to this abandoned house that supposedly a cop was killed in and now no one lived there. It was pretty odd inside. The floor was a foot deep with just broken furniture and detritus. It was like whoever abandoned the place left everything they owned there and then kids came in and smashed it all and left it on the floor. Creepy house, but I didn't feel anything oppressive or weird about it. I was there during the day, alone, but I didn't get any chills or anything. Took photos of the downstairs and then went upstairs. The stairs were wood and looked pretty secure, not obviously rotted or anything. While I'm up there, I heard a cop car pull up outside and chirp its siren. 2 cops came into the house and I yelled down where I was. One of the cops told me to stay there and started to come upstairs. I had gone up no problem, and this dude was a skinny little rookie looking dude, so we were honestly probably the same weight. Except that every time he put his weight on one of the steps, it broke. Sometimes just a little, so he kept going, but twice his foot went all the way through the step. It was the weirdest thing. Eventually he backed off and I came down. None of the upper steps broke for me and I jumped down over the broken ones. They took me home and it was fine, but that's still the weirdest experience of my life. Maybe something in that house still really hated cops. Not law enforcement, but hospital chaplain. I was on call one night. I got a call from a nurse about 3 a.m. saying that she got stuck with a psych patient, as they were considered psychotic but not enough to be placed in the behavioral health unit. The PT was admitted a few days back, but suddenly just stopped talking to the nurses, other than saying I'm dead, and I can't talk to the living. Working in an area with many drug abuse PTs and an unusually high amount of psych patients, an event like this wasn't too strange. However, seeing as they were having a hard time trying to communicate with the PT, the nurse was kind of fed up and just called the on-call chaplain to see if I could help. I arrive at about 3 a.m., and the nurse tells me what I just told you. The nurse escorts me in the room and the PT gives her the same one-liner spiel. Upon seeing me, she said, "Oh, you're dead too. I can talk to you." The PT then indicated for the nurse to leave, and I sat and talked for a good hour of this PT's concerns, how they were going to die soon and felt unable to talk to any of the living. However, the PT insisted that I was dead too and that I was the only one she could talk to. Without breaking HIPAA, she gave some general end-of-life concerns one would typically see, with the added benefit of how she was able to get glimpses of heaven but because of this could not really talk to the living. Having personally responded to other behavioral health complaints involving religious psychosis, I took this as another typical case. I was able to get the information and communicate the wishes of the nurse, and after explaining the details to the nurse, left shortly thereafter. I made it back home and am just getting to sleep, as I get a call from the operator saying there is a code in the same room and part I just left, and I was asked to come back in. By the time I made it to the hospital, the PT had died. Arguably the weirdest case I've ever handled. Hello. Long dense read ahead, and I apologize. Anyhow, I was working at around 2 a.m. on the north end of my jurisdiction on a dirt road that dipped slightly down in elevation into a tamarack and red/white pine swamp. In patrolling along the road because it's a known back way for drunk drivers to take to avoid the main route at bar time in between neighboring villages. Just south of me a quarter-mile as the crow flies is a small Native American reservation populated with residential, but I'm essential working somewhere that I shouldn't see anyone other than passing vehicles, certainly no one on foot. It's end summer, early fall where the days are warm but the nights were cold. As I'm driving I have my window down enjoying the brisk temps. I'm a Wisconsinite, and for some reason I was driving fairly slow, probably only about 20 miles per hour. Off to my left I hear very distinctly the sound of water thrashing, and my mind initially thinks I hear maybe a deer or a bear running through the water. Had seen a black bear the night before near where I was on this night. I came to a quick stop and used my spotlight and left alley takedown floodlight to hit where I thought I'd see something like the black bear fellow, but there was zero movement, just the sound of weighty water slushing away from me. Where I was looking was not thick with woods, but more adolescent pines and smaller underbrush with a dry ridge only 50 yards away from me. I had lots of clear sight lines in between larger pines to the hill past the water. I estimated the water to be only maybe a foot deep, but as I'm seeing nothing make the sounds that I'm hearing, my mind then thinks that maybe it's a someone in the water but hiding behind a tree to avoid me, and so I have a concern for them because of how cold it was that morning. But I see nothing. The sounds of water moving was very distinct and to me sounded bipedal, and heavy, and my perception was telling me that I should be seeing something only a couple dozen feet away from me, but there was just the sound. I called out asking if anyone was there, but nothing. The swishing of water stopped, and I saw nothing walking up the ridge as if it had cleared the water. I didn't spend much longer looking into the barely lit woods over the water. I rolled my window up and continued on, briefly hoping that I hadn't stranded a guy in the dark cold wet woods. That's what my rational mind was thinking, but there was definitely a shit alarm going off in my lizard brain telling me to scoot the fuck out of there the moment I didn't see anything running through the water. It was a back of the neck tingly moment. The noise was so loud, enough to hear it while driving in a vehicle, but there was only the pretty calm shimmer of the water and nothing that I could see running through a foot of water. This happened 2 falls ago and I remember that morning every time I drive through there. I once a very long time ago before college worked midnights as a hospital security dispatcher. I worked in the basement of the hospital. Around the corner the morgue as security are the people who release bodies to funeral homes. I'd have one of the 16 screens of our CCTV system on that at all times as it was the morgue and the washroom across from it. I had an officer come to relieve me so I could use the washroom. I walked down the hall past the morgue and into the washroom that had a double set of doors. I was in a stall and I heard someone come in the washroom opening both doors and the doors closed and I heard slipper footsteps. No one entered a stall or went to a urinal. When I got out of my stall to wash my hands no one was in the bathroom, none of the stalls had anyone and I was baffled as to where the door opening person went. These doors did not have mobility electric openers, they were pure push and pull. Once I returned to my dispatch I rolled back the CCTV to see what the hell happened, who is fucking with me near the morgue and opening doors while I'm trying to take a midnight dump. Turns out no one. The replay didn't even show the door open. To this day I'm glad my job isn't in a hospital with my office beside the morgue. I don't believe in the supernatural, however I am still unable to explain what happened that night. Not a cop but a security guard. I worked at a night desk in a retirement home. I had 3 strange incidents happen while I was there. The front doors formed a vestibule and were triggered by motion. In the vestibule we kept walkers and a wheelchair for whoever needed one. One night I stepped outside for maybe 3 minutes. When I turned to go back in the wheelchair had been placed in the center of the vestibule without opening either of the doors. The lobby had 2 large wooden tables and chairs. They were solid and heavy. One night I was summoned to help a resident to get to her apt. I go upstairs, render aid and return downstairs to my desk. I walked the whole room before realizing a table and chair had been placed across the lobby. These things were huge and heavy. No way could elderly people have moved them. Across from my desk and through the lobby was a door to the kitchen. The other was locked. As in every kitchen there were stacked stainless steel pans. One night I heard a loud clatter. I get up and go see what's up. 2 pans had been lifted from the stack and tossed to the floor. There was no way anyone could have been in there without being seen. My grandpa was part of the force a few decades back, and he would tell me this story all the time. He got a call to head to an old house. It was on the back of the street and surrounded by vacant properties. Anyway, he and his partner knocked on the door and some opens it up. I remember him telling me his first thought was goddamn someone lives here. Anyway, they walk in and it is a pretty up-shape home. It's nice and clean, and it even has a gas oven. The owner tells him that her daughter sees a man every night, and he just sits next to her on her bed. They walk upstairs and search the room and the attic, no footprints or anything, so they walk downstairs and tell the owner they have to leave. They come back every once in a while, as they get the same call, and eventually the homeowner moves away with her daughter. They received a 911 call from the new homeowner, and this is a few years later. All the vacant homes in the old one was torn down and new ones were built. The mother, whose husband was killed in an accident, says that her daughter is having trouble sleeping. Grandpa asked her why and she replied with a man sits down on her bed and talks to her. Grandpa said he searched and found nothing, but he just wanted to get out of there. Still says it was his best case though. Not a cop or anything but a tour guide at a French and Indian war fort. The place has a reputation for being haunted and the ghost hunters have been there, but overall, it's a pretty quiet place and most of the workers think people just hear the building creak and groan and attribute it to something paranormal when it isn't. But anyway, on one of my tours, I was talking to an older gentleman, like 60 to 70, and he was telling me that he realized he was a sensitive, can see, hear, feel ghostly presences easily, when he was a little boy and his grandmother died. He told me he wasn't allowed to go to her open casket wake because he was too young. But while he was sitting home with a babysitter, he told me his grandmother just suddenly walked through the door, came up to him, smiled and waved goodbye before disappearing. So when his family came home from the wake, he said to them, "Grandma sure looked pretty in her dress." They looked at him with question marks on their faces and said, "How would you know? You didn't see her." He told them, "She came to say goodbye." And then proceeded to describe in detail exactly what she was wearing. He said his family was stunned. So when he gets to this part of his story, something odd happened. We are standing outside in the middle of August, so needless to say it was sunny and warm, when on my right side, I can only describe it as it felt like someone had turned an air conditioner on not 2 feet away from me. It wasn't just a cold breeze or anything like that, it was continuous, lightly blowing cold air, and it wasn't stopping. I said to the man, "Do you feel that?" He looked at me with a little smile on his face and said, "There's someone listening in on our conversation. He's standing just a little to your right." The cold air persisted for about a minute or two while we just stood there in silence, when finally it disappeared altogether, like someone had switched off the air conditioner, and right at that moment he said, "He's gone now." I've worked in the place for about 6 years now and this was my only real experience, but I can still remember the feeling of that cold air and how the air actually moved and blew, like from a fan or air conditioner, and that fact made it all the more creepy and real to me. I was serving guard duty in the army. This is a small town in Eastern Europe, nothing really risky, and while I was standing perfectly still near my guard post, and just looking around, I hear a cough, not a random cough, but one of those "excuse me KHM coughs people use when they want to address you." It was coming from a nearby building, just 4 or 5 meters away from me, really. The building itself is stacked full of mines actually, no room for people inside, but it had these vertical niches, for some security reason about the explosives, I think, about 60 centimeters wide, and 60 centimeters deep every 2 meters, just enough for a person to stand in it. I could not see inside it, nearest light was 100 meters away. It was full moon, it made the walls of the building perfectly light and white, but it shone basically directly above the building, so the niches themselves were pitch black. I make a few steps near it, and say hey. And then from one of the niches, clear as music, I hear another KHM, definitely a human cough. We are supposed to follow procedure and say the usual movie lines: halt. Who goes there? Etc., etc., and while I think what to do, I hear footsteps behind me. It's the patrol, my squad buddies, doing routine tours. I decide to stay silent and wait for them, not moving my eyes from the dark niche in a concrete building. They arrive 3 or 4 minutes later, and are in a good mood. I tell them, "You have flashlights, right? Light this niche." They shine light at it, and couple of niches left and right, and there is nothing there. I tell them nothing. About 10 minutes later, my commanding officer comes to relieve me, with my guard replacement, and we go back to the main guard house, where everyone else is sleeping. The thing is, this was in a remote location, everyone is either at guard post, or sleeping in the guardhouse, with no villages, dogs, or anything else really close, not to mention the high fence that surrounds the compound. I just told the guy replacing me not to get spooked by sounds. It was 3 a.m. midwinter 2013. I used to deliver newspapers out in the middle of nowhere. Houses were easily 5 miles apart or more. Tonight was different than the others. It was cold enough the cows, and other livestock, were all hiding somewhere warm. At the outside of my route I was driving towards a T-stop and saw something ahead, but I couldn't identify it. This was the most remote area of my route, and the stop indicated the last before the fields ended and you could see the start of the wild northwest forest. As I got closer, the lights of my car revealed a plain-looking man, white t-shirt and white boxers and no shoes. He was facing away from the road, staring directly towards the dark of the woods. He didn't move and his breath didn't give off any steam. He didn't react to my car, my voice, he just stared into the dark as if I weren't there. It freaked me out so badly I wouldn't drive past him and actually sped away. I had to go back down that road later to finish my route and he was gone. No freaking tracks in the snow, not that I could really tell at 5 a.m. with only my headlights. I changed my route and tried my best to always avoid that area.